My name is Sergeant Marak Venn, 3rd Platoon, Catachan XXIII Devil's Eyes Regiment, and this record should not exist. I am committing it to Vox capture knowing full well that its discovery means my execution, but I have come to understand that execution is a mercy I may no longer deserve. What I am about to confess is not treason in the way the commissariat would recognize it. It is something worse. It is the documentation of a realization, and realizations, I have learned, are more dangerous than any weapon fielded by the enemies of the Imperium. I was born on Catachan. This is not a boast. It is a statement of statistical improbability. Catachan does not produce citizens. It produces survivors, and only after it has tested them in ways that would kill a Space Marine aspirant before their first trial. My first memory is of my mother's face, half dissolved by the venom of a Catachan barking toad, telling me to run. I was 4 years old. I ran. She died. This is not tragedy on Catachan. This is curriculum. By the time I was 12, I had killed 17 things that wanted to eat me. By 15, I had killed men who wanted what my settlement had stored in our humidity-sealed bunkers. By 17, I was recruited into the Guard, not because I was special, or because I had survived long enough to be noticed. The Imperium does not conscript Catachans. It simply waits at the edge of the jungle and collects those strong enough to reach the recruitment stations. The weak are fertilizer. The strong are ammunition. I want you to understand this foundation because everything that follows depends upon it. I was not indoctrinated into the Imperial Creed through sermons or chapels. I was indoctrinated through survival. The God Emperor was not a distant theological concept. He was the reason my lost gun fired when I pulled the trigger. He was the reason the supply drop arrived before we starved. He was the operational framework within which human life persisted against a galaxy that wanted us extinct. Faith for a Catachan is not about belief. It is about function. The Emperor functions. Therefore, the Emperor is. Our first deployment was to a world called Vorash Secundus, a mining colony that had stopped responding to tithe demands. The official briefing said insurrection. The truth was more mundane. A warp storm had delayed their shipments, and the Administratum, its infinite bureaucratic patience, had declared them rebellious for missing a quota. We were sent to restore order. This meant we were sent to kill anyone who resisted the restoration of tithe schedules. I remember the first civilian I shot. He was 60, maybe 70 years old. Holding a mining laser he barely knew how to operate. He was screaming about his children being taken for labor conscription. I shot him through the chest because my orders were clear and because hesitation in combat gets you killed. He fell into a collapsed mine shaft, and I never saw his body. I did not think about him that night. I did not think about him for years. This is what training does. It creates distance between the action and the reflection. It ensures that by the time you are capable of reflection, you have committed so many actions that no single one seems worthy of examination. But I remember him now. I remember them all now. Not because I have developed a conscience, but because I have developed a context. Context is the enemy of certainty, and certainty is what makes a soldier functional. We fought on Vorash Secundus for 7 months. The insurrection that did not exist became real the moment we arrived. Our presence created the resistance it was meant to suppress. This is a pattern I would see repeated across a dozen worlds. The Imperium does not respond to threats. It creates them through the active response. By the time we left Vorash Secundus, 16,000 civilians were dead. The mining operations were reduced to 20% capacity, and my platoon had lost 40% of its strength to improvised explosives and sniper fire. Command declared it a victory. We were redeployed within a week. Catachans do not speak much. Our homeworld teaches us that noise attracts predators, but in the troop transport, drifting through the warp toward our next assignment, I began to notice something. The younger soldiers, the ones fresh from the jungles, still had the Catachan silence. But the veterans, the ones who had fought across multiple deployments, had developed a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of hunters. It was the silence of men who had stopped asking questions because they had learned that questions led to answers they could not reconcile with their duties. I was becoming one of them. I could feel it. The calcification of thought, the narrowing of perspective, the transformation from a man who survived because he adapted into a man who survived because he obeyed. And I welcomed it. I welcomed it because doubt is a luxury that combat does not permit. A soldier who questions his orders is a soldier who hesitates. A soldier who hesitates is a soldier who dies and takes his squad mates with him. But then we were deployed to Kallista's world, and everything I had constructed to make myself functional began to erode. Kallista's world was listed in our briefing documents as a feral world, minimal Imperial presence, recently compliant. Our objective was to establish a recruitment station and begin conscription operations. Standard procedure: arrive, demonstrate Imperial authority, process the population for Guard quality candidates. The PDF forces would handle integration. We were there to provide enforcement and training assessment. The world itself was beautiful. I say this with full awareness of how irrelevant beauty is to military operations, but I say it because beauty was the first anomaly. Catachan is beautiful too, in the way a coiled serpent is beautiful. Kallista's world was different. It was gentle. The vegetation was not actively hostile. The fauna was not universally venomous. The population lived in small, sustainable communities that had existed for centuries without collapsing into the kind of brutal survivalism that defines feral worlds. They should not have been compliant. That was my first thought. A population this stable, this self-sufficient, does not surrender sovereignty to an interstellar empire without cause. But the records indicated they had requested Imperial protection 3 years prior, following the records were vague here, following an external cultural contamination event. The ecclesiarchy had been involved. Missionaries had been dispatched. Compliance had been established. We landed in the largest settlement, a place called Verdant Crossing, population approximately 50,000. The architecture was low, integrated with the landscape. No fortifications, no defensive positions. The people watched us disembark with expressions I had not seen before. Not fear, not hostility, something closer to pity. Our first week was procedural. We established command in the old missionary chapel. We began processing candidates, and that is when I met Prelate Jostin, the ecclesiarchy representative who had overseen the world's integration into the Imperium. He was a thin man, older, with the kind of eyes that suggested he had stopped sleeping years ago. He welcomed us formally, provided full cooperation, and then, on the third night, he requested a private meeting. I should have reported this request to my commanding officer. I should have brought a witness. But Catachans are trained to trust their instincts, and my instincts told me that Prelate Jostin was not dangerous. He was terrified. We met in a storage room beneath the chapel. He locked the door. He checked for Vox surveillance. And then he said 6 words that would change the trajectory of my life. You need to understand what we did. Prelate Jostin did not begin with explanation. He began with a question. Sergeant, have you ever wondered why Catachan produces the finest soldiers in the Imperium? I told him it was because our world killed the weak. He shook his head. No, he said. It is because your world gives you no time to think about what you are becoming. He was right, of course, but I did not understand yet what he meant. I did not understand that this was not philosophy. It was diagnosis. He told me that 3 years ago, Kallista's world had been a paradise by Imperial standards. No war, no famine, no Xenos threats. The population had developed a stable, peaceful culture based on agricultural cooperation and communal decision-making. They had no concept of the Imperium. They had no concept of the galaxy beyond their star system. They existed in a state of ignorant contentment that, by all rights, should have been impossible in a universe as hostile as ours. Then the missionaries arrived, not at the invitation of Kallista's world, but as part of a routine ecclesiarchy expansion mission. They brought the Imperial Creed. They brought the history of humanity's suffering. They brought the truth of chaos, of Xenos, of the eternal war for survival. And they explained that Kallista's world had been protected only by obscurity, that their peace was borrowed time, and that compliance with the Imperium was the only path to salvation. The population resisted at first, not violently, but philosophically. They argued that their way of life had sustained them for centuries. They argued that introducing the concept of external enemies would destroy the internal harmony that made their society functional. They were, Prelate Jostin said, correct in this assessment. But correctness is not currency in the Imperium. Only compliance is. The ecclesiarchy did what it always does. It identified the community leaders, the philosophers, the individuals who shaped cultural consensus. And it began a program of re-education, not through violence, though violence was available if necessary. Through revelation. They showed these leaders pick captures of worlds burning under Xeno's invasion. They showed them testimonies of populations consumed by chaos corruption. They showed them the archaeological evidence of human civilizations that had existed in peace and prosperity before being annihilated by forces they had no framework to understand. We broke them, Prelate Jostin said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. We did not have to threaten them. We simply made them understand what existed beyond their atmosphere, and that understanding destroyed their ability to maintain the social structures that had protected them. Within 6 months, Kallista's world had formally requested Imperial integration. Within a year, they had built a chapel where we now stood. Within 18 months, they had begun tithing their youth to the Imperial Guard, not because they were forced to, but because they had been convinced that it was necessary, that it was moral, that it was the only rational response to the revealed horror of the galaxy. And it was, Prelate Jostin said. That is what keeps me awake, Sergeant. It was the correct decision. Everything we told them was true. The galaxy is exactly as hostile as we described. Their peace was an anomaly that could not last. By bringing them into compliance, we saved them from a future annihilation that was statistically inevitable. I asked him why he was telling me this, why this was a secret that required a locked room and a checked door. He leaned closer, because in the process of saving them, we destroyed the thing that made them worth saving. Before we arrived, they had built a society without war, without oppression, without the apparatus of control that defines every other human world in the Imperium. And we unmade it, not through conquest, but through education. We taught them to be afraid, and fear is the foundation of every tyranny in human history. I told him that fear is also the foundation of survival, that a population without fear is a population awaiting extinction. I told him what I had been taught, what every Catachan knows, that the universe is hostile and only the prepared survive. Yes, he said, but prepared for what? And at what cost? He produced a data slate from beneath his robes. It was old, the kind used for personal records rather than official documentation. He told me it contained testimonies from the community leaders of Kallista's world, recorded before and after their re-education. He said I should read them if I wanted to understand what compliance actually meant, what it cost, what it transformed. I should have refused. I should have reported him immediately. Instead, I took the data slate. I took it because some part of me, some part that had survived Catachan's jungles by being curious about new threats, recognized that Prelate Jostin was offering me information that had been deliberately concealed. And concealment, in my experience, indicated danger. That night, alone in my billet, I read the testimonies. I read the words of a woman named Selamorn, who had been the chief agricultural coordinator for the largest settlement. Before re-education, her testimony was filled with technical descriptions of crop rotation, water management, communal labor distribution. She spoke about her work with pride and precision. She spoke about her community with love. After re-education, her testimony was different. She still spoke precisely, but the content had changed. She spoke about the necessity of fortification, the importance of military training, the moral imperative of sacrifice for the Emperor, and beneath the words, between them, around them, there was a kind of desperate exhaustion, as if she was trying to convince herself, as if she knew she had lost something irreplaceable, but could not articulate what it was, or why it mattered. I read dozens of these testimonies. The pattern was consistent. Before re-education, the people of Kallista's world spoke about their present. After re-education, they spoke about preventing a future. They had been transformed from people who lived into people who prepared. And in that transformation, something fundamental had been amputated. But what disturbed me most was not the transformation itself. It was my inability to identify what, precisely, had been lost. Everything they said after re-education was correct. The galaxy was hostile. Preparation was necessary. Compliance ensured survival. Their previous way of life had been unsustainable. By every objective measure, the ecclesiarchy had improved their long-term survival probability. So, why did reading these testimonies feel like witnessing a murder? I did not sleep that night. I lay in my billet and tried to reconcile what I had read with what I knew to be true. The Imperium is brutal, yes. The Imperium is oppressive, yes. But the Imperium is necessary. Humanity's enemies are real. The threats are not exaggerated. Without the apparatus of control, without the military infrastructure, without the religious indoctrination that binds a million worlds into coordinated resistance, humanity would be extinct within a generation. This is not propaganda. This is mathematics. This is observed reality. I had fought Xenos. I had seen what chaos corruption does to human minds. I had walked through the ruins of worlds that had rejected imperial authority and paid the price in blood and ash. The Imperium is monstrous, but it is a necessary monstrosity. The alternative is annihilation. But then why did the testimonies read like confessions? Why did Prelate Jostin look like a man haunted by his own success? The next morning, I returned the data slate. I told him I had read it. I told him I understood what he had shown me. And then I asked him what he expected me to do with this understanding. He looked at me with those exhausted eyes and said, I do not know. I showed you because someone else needed to carry this weight. Because I am tired of being the only person who understands what we are doing. I asked him what we were doing. What specifically he believed the crime to be. We are saving humanity, he said, by making it no longer worth saving. I should have dismissed this as heresy. I should have reported him to the commissariat. Instead, I asked him to explain, and he did, for 3 hours, in that locked storage room beneath a chapel on a world that had been peaceful until we taught it fear. Prelate Jostin explained the mechanism by which the Imperium perpetuates itself. The Imperium does not control through force alone. It controls through the management of possibility. Every human world is taught that the galaxy is hostile, that survival requires obedience, that alternatives to imperial authority lead only to destruction. And because this is statistically true, because the galaxy is exactly as hostile as we claim, the population accepts the necessity of control. They accept the loss of autonomy, the suppression of dissent, the sacrifice of the present for a future that never arrives. They accept it because we show them what happens to worlds that refuse. We never show them the worlds that found another way, Prelate Jostin said. We never show them the populations that built something different, because those populations, when we find them, we destroy, not because they are threats, but because they are alternatives. And alternatives are the only real threat to the Imperium's ideological monopoly. I did not believe Prelate Jostin at first, not because I thought he was lying, but because the implications of his claim were too vast to accept without evidence. The idea that the Imperium systematically destroyed functional human societies simply because they represented alternatives to imperial authority seemed, at the time, absurd. The Imperium has enemies enough without manufacturing them from peaceful populations. Why would it waste resources eliminating societies that posed no military threat? But Jostin anticipated my skepticism. He had prepared for it. Over the following weeks, during moments when we could meet without attracting attention, he showed me documents that should not have existed. Missionary reports marked for destruction after review. Inquisitorial memoranda discussing cultural sterilization protocols. Administratum demographic analyses comparing compliant worlds with non-integrated holdouts. The pattern, once visible, was undeniable. The Imperium encounters, on average, 17 previously unknown human populations per year. These are not colony ships gone astray or lost expeditionary forces. These are human civilizations that evolved independently, either having been isolated since the dark age of technology or having developed from generation ships that predated the age of strife. Some are primitive, some are technologically advanced, some are peaceful, some are warlike, but all share one characteristic. They develop without imperial influence, and therefore exist as evidence that humanity can organize itself in ways other than the imperial model. The official policy, documented in the Missionaris Galaxia Protocols, is integration through enlightenment. This sounds benign. It is not. Integration through enlightenment means the systematic destruction of whatever social, cultural, or philosophical framework allowed that civilization to function independently. It means the introduction of imperial ideology as a replacement for indigenous belief systems, and it means ensuring that within 2 generations, the population cannot remember or conceive of life organized by any principle other than service to the Emperor. It works, Jostin said, because we are not lying to them. Everything we tell them about the galaxy's hostility is true, but we never tell them that their own system might have been capable of navigating that hostility without becoming what we are. We never give them the chance to find out. I asked him how many of these independent civilizations had been destroyed not by Xenos or chaos, but by imperial integration. He said he did not know. The records were not kept in a way that would make such analysis possible, but he estimated, based on the missionary reports he had reviewed, that it was thousands, perhaps tens of thousands over the 10 millennia since the Emperor's ascension. We are very good at it now, he said. We have refined the process. We know exactly how much truth to reveal and when. We know how to break cultural confidence without triggering armed resistance. We know how to make compliance feel like salvation. I asked him if he believed this was wrong, if he believed the Imperium should allow these populations to remain independent, even knowing that independence would likely result in their eventual destruction by external forces. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I do not know if it is wrong. I only know that it is irreversible, and that we never ask whether it should be." This distinction is important. Jostin was not arguing for rebellion. He was not suggesting that the Imperium's methods were unjustifiable. He was simply observing that the Imperium had structured itself in such a way that certain questions could not be asked, and that this inability to question was itself a form of control. Not control over populations, but control over the possibility of imagining alternatives. I have thought about this constantly since those conversations. I have turned it over in my mind during combat, during transport, during the long hours of guard duty where the only enemy is your own thoughts. And I have come to understand that Jostin was describing something more fundamental than policy. He was describing the architecture of necessity itself. The Imperium functions because it has convinced its population that there is no alternative. Not that alternatives are inferior, but that they do not exist. That the only possible responses to a hostile galaxy are submission to imperial authority or death. And because the galaxy is genuinely hostile, because the threats are real and constant, this claim feels true. It feels like observed reality rather than imposed ideology. But what if it is both? What if the Imperium's claim to necessity is true but incomplete? What if there are other ways to organize human survival, and the Imperium's insistence that they are not as itself the mechanism that makes them impossible? This is the question that Jostin planted in my mind, and it is the question that has grown like a fungal infection through every certainty I once held. We completed our mission on Kallista's world. We processed 600 candidates for guard recruitment. We established the infrastructure for ongoing conscription. We trained the local PDF forces in standard Imperial combat doctrine, and in doing so, we ensured that within a generation, Kallista's world would be indistinguishable from any other compliant world in the Imperium. The children born after our arrival would know only the Imperial framework. They would believe, as I had believed, that the Emperor's way was the only way, and they would enforce that belief on their own children, and so on, until the memory of what Kallista's world had been before we arrived existed only in restricted archives that no one would ever read. On our last night before departure, Jostin came to me again. He looked worse than before, thinner, more exhausted. He told me he had requested transfer to a penal world mission, a form of self-imposed penance. He said he could not continue doing to other worlds what he had done to Kallista's world, but he also could not stop believing that it was necessary. The contradiction had made him non-functional. "You will carry this better than I did," he said. "Catachans are built for survival. You will find a way to reconcile it." I asked him what would happen if I could not reconcile it, if the contradiction broke me the way it had broken him. He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Then you will understand what we do to every population we integrate. You will understand that compliance is not acceptance. It is the death of the ability to imagine refusal." I did not report Prelate Jostin. I have asked myself many times why I made that decision. The easy answer is that he had committed no actionable heresy. He had questioned imperial methods, but he had not advocated for their abandonment. He had expressed doubt, but doubt is not treason. The commissariat might have disagreed, but I chose to interpret his actions as loyal dissent rather than ideological corruption. But the honest answer is darker. I did not report him because some part of me wanted to protect the possibility that he was right, that the questions he was asking were legitimate, that the doubts he carried were not weakness, but clarity, and protecting that possibility meant protecting him. This, I have come to understand, is how corruption begins, not with dramatic betrayal, but with small decisions to preserve uncomfortable truths, with the choice to not report, to not investigate, to allow questions to exist in spaces where they should be eliminated. The Imperium's security depends on the immediate suppression of doubt, and I had allowed doubt to survive. I had become its accomplice. We were redeployed to a world called Tertius, another insurrection, another population that had decided imperial tithes were too burdensome and that rebellion was preferable to compliance. The combat was brutal. The rebels had fortified the industrial sectors and were using the infrastructure against us. We lost 30% of our effective strength in the first month, but we won because we always win. Because the Imperium has infinite soldiers and infinite time, and the ability to reduce any world to ash if compliance cannot be achieved through conventional means. I killed hundreds of people on Tertius, maybe thousands. It is difficult to maintain accurate counts during urban combat, but I remember their faces differently now. Before Kallista's world, before Jostin, they had been targets, obstacles to mission completion. After, they were evidence. Evidence that populations do resist, that compliance is not inevitable, that some human beings, when faced with the choice between submission and annihilation, choose annihilation. Why? Why would they choose death over compliance? The Imperium does not demand love. It does not demand belief. It demands only obedience and taxes. Why is that threshold so unbearable that entire populations will sacrifice themselves rather than submit? I began asking the prisoners this question, quietly, during interrogations that I was conducting for intelligence purposes. I would ask them why they resisted, what they hoped to achieve, what alternative they imagined was possible. Most could not answer. They were fighting because their leaders told them to fight, because their families were fighting, because they had already killed Imperial forces and knew that surrender meant execution. But some, a small percentage, gave different answers. They said they resisted because compliance meant becoming something they were not, because Imperial integration required the abandonment of cultural practices, social structures, belief systems that defined their identity, because the choice was not between death and survival, but between death and a form of survival that was indistinguishable from death. One prisoner, a woman named Kall, who had been a district administrator before the rebellion, said something I have never forgotten. She said, "You think you are saving us from destruction, but you are the destruction. The Xenos might kill our bodies, but you kill whatever makes those bodies worth preserving." I executed Kall 3 days after that conversation, not as punishment for her words, but because those were my orders. All captured rebel leadership were to be publicly executed as a deterrent to future insurrection. I shot her in the back of the head in the central plaza of District 7, in front of approximately 2,000 civilians who had been assembled to witness imperial justice. She did not beg. She did not scream. She knelt in the position I indicated and waited for the loss round that would end her life. The last thing she said, too quietly for anyone but me to hear, was, "Thank you for making it quick." I have killed many people. I have killed them in combat, in ambushes, in interrogations that became executions. I have killed them with lost guns, with knives, with my hands when ammunition was scarce. I have killed them because they were enemies, because they were liabilities, because they were in the way of objectives that command had deemed necessary. And I have done this without hesitation because hesitation is a luxury that combat does not permit, and because I believed, with absolute certainty, that my actions served a larger purpose that justified their necessity. But when I killed Kall, something changed. Not in the act itself. The mechanics of execution are identical regardless of the target's philosophical position, but in my understanding of what the act meant, I was not eliminating a threat. I was eliminating a question. The question was whether Imperial compliance represented salvation or annihilation of a different kind, and by executing the person who asked it, I was ensuring that the question could not spread, that it could not contaminate other minds, that it would die with her. This is what the Imperium does. It does not defeat ideas through argument or evidence. It defeats them through the systematic elimination of everyone who carries them, and it calls this victory. And by every tactical measure, it is victory. The rebellion on Guest Tertius collapsed within 2 months of Kall's execution. The population returned to compliance. Tithe production resumed. The world was reintegrated into the Imperial administrative framework. From the perspective of strategic objectives, the operation was a complete success. But I could not stop thinking about what Kall had said. That we were the destruction. That Imperial salvation was indistinguishable from the annihilation it claimed to prevent. I could not stop thinking about it, because I could not definitively prove it false. The Imperium does destroy cultures, languages, belief systems, social structures. It does reduce every human population to a standardized template of behavior and thought. It does eliminate diversity in favor of uniformity. This is not secret. This is not hidden. This is official policy, documented in 1,000 different administrative protocols. The question is whether this destruction is justified, whether the uniformity it creates is the only viable defense against a galaxy that would otherwise tear humanity apart through its infinite variations and vulnerabilities, whether the Imperium's methods are the tragic but necessary response to an existential threat, or whether they are themselves a form of the very annihilation they claim to prevent. I could not answer this question, but I also could not stop asking it. And the inability to answer combined with the inability to stop asking created a kind of psychological corrosion that I recognized from Prelate Justin's face. I was becoming what he had been, a loyal servant of the Imperium who understood too much about what loyalty required. Our next deployment was to a world called Catachan XXIII, and it was there that I encountered something that should not have existed. We were sent to suppress what the briefing documents described as a feral human population with aberrant social structures. The population numbered approximately 3 million and occupied a region of dense jungle in the world's equatorial zone. They had no contact with the Imperium. They had no visible technology beyond simple tools. They were, by all standard assessments, primitive, but they had survived in that jungle for over 4,000 years. And the jungle, our environmental assessments quickly determined, was nearly as hostile as Catachan. The flora was aggressively carnivorous. The fauna was universally venomous. The weather patterns included acid rain and fungal spore storms that could strip flesh from bone in minutes. By every calculation, a primitive population should have been extinct within a generation. Yet they thrived. Not merely survived, but thrived. Their settlements were stable. Their population was growing. Their health metrics, based on preliminary observation, were superior to most Imperial worlds. And they had achieved this without any of the technological infrastructure that the Imperium insists is necessary for human survival in hostile environments. How? This was the question that obsessed me from the moment we established our perimeter. How had a population with no lost guns, no body armor, no off-world support, no medical technology beyond herbal remedies, survived in an environment that killed trained Catachan soldiers? The answer, I would learn, was knowledge, but not knowledge of the kind the Imperium recognizes. Not technical specifications or tactical doctrine. Something older. Something that the Imperium had spent 10,000 years systematically eradicating. We captured several members of the population for interrogation. They did not resist. They did not flee. They simply watched us with the same expression I had seen on Kallista's world. That look of pity, as if they understood something about us that we did not understand about ourselves. The interrogations were conducted by our attached commissar, a man named Garrick, who had 30 years of experience in ideological compliance assessment. He was thorough, he was professional, and he was increasingly disturbed by what he was hearing. After the third interrogation, he requested a private meeting with command staff. I was included as senior NCO. They have no leadership structure, Garrick said. No chiefs, no councils, no administrative hierarchy. They make decisions through consensus processes that involve the entire community. And yet, they maintain complex coordination across settlements separated by hundreds of kilometers of hostile terrain. I asked how that was possible. How do you achieve coordination without centralized command? How do you maintain security without hierarchy? How do you prevent the inevitable power struggles that emerge in any human population? They claim they do not prevent them, Garrick said. They claim power struggles are a symptom of scarcity and competition, and that their social structure eliminates both by ensuring every individual has what they need and no individual can accumulate resources beyond necessity. They claim that hierarchy is a response to threat, and that they have structured their society to eliminate the conditions that generate threat. This sounded like heresy. This sounded like the kind of utopian delusion that the Imperium exists to correct. But Garrick was not reporting delusion. He was reporting observed reality. A population that had structured itself according to principles that Imperial doctrine insisted were impossible. And that population had not merely survived but flourished in conditions that would destroy a standard Imperial colony within months. "What do you recommend?" our commanding officer asked. Garrick was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Standard integration protocol. We disrupt their social structure, introduce scarcity through controlled resource deprivation, establish a leadership hierarchy that we can negotiate with, and begin the process of Imperial indoctrination. Within 2 years, they will be compliant. Within 5, they will not remember what they were before we arrived." I asked him if there was an alternative, if we could simply observe them, study them, understand how they had achieved what they had achieved, whether their methods might be applicable to other populations. Garrick looked at me with something between pity and contempt. "Sergeant, what they have achieved is survival outside the Imperial framework. That alone makes them a threat, not because they might attack us, but because their existence proves that the Imperial framework is not the only viable model for human civilization. And if that proof spreads, if other populations learn that alternatives are possible, the entire ideological foundation of the Imperium begins to erode. We cannot allow that. Not because we are cruel, but because we are practical. The Imperium's unity is the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. Anything that threatens that unity, no matter how peaceful its intentions, must be eliminated." This was the most honest statement of Imperial policy I had ever heard, not dressed in religious language about the Emperor's will, not obscured by tactical necessity or strategic objectives, just the plain truth. The Imperium destroys alternatives because alternatives are threats to its monopoly on human organization, and that monopoly is what the Imperium believes keeps humanity alive. But what if the monopoly itself is what makes humanity vulnerable? What if the Imperium's insistence on uniformity eliminates the adaptive diversity that biological systems require for long-term survival? What if we are securing humanity's present by destroying its evolutionary future? These were the questions I could not ask out loud. These were the questions that would have resulted in my immediate execution if I had voiced them. So I remained silent. I followed orders, and over the next 3 months, I participated in the systematic destruction of a human society that had survived for 4,000 years without Imperial assistance. We did not kill them. That would have been wasteful. We simply made their previous way of life impossible. We introduced imperial agriculture, which required individual land ownership. We introduced imperial trade goods, which required currency. We introduced imperial law, which required enforcement hierarchy. And we explained, patiently and repeatedly, that these changes were necessary for their protection, that the galaxy was hostile, that their isolation had been temporary luck, that compliance was not oppression but salvation. And they believed us. Not immediately, but eventually, because everything we told them was true. The galaxy was hostile. Their isolation was temporary. Without imperial protection, they would eventually be destroyed by Xenos or Chaos, or one of 1,000 other threats. We were not lying to them. We were simply omitting the fact that imperial protection required the death of everything that had made their survival possible in the first place. I have been a soldier for 23 years. I have served on 47 worlds across 11 sectors. I have fought orcs, tyranids, heretics, rebels, and things that had no name in any imperial classification system. I have been wounded 16 times. I have been decorated for valor 8 times. I have been recommended for promotion to officer rank 4 times, and declined each recommendation because Catachans do not trust officers who lose connection with the soldiers they command. I am, by every objective measure, a loyal and effective servant of the Imperium. But I am also something else now. I am a man who has recognized a pattern, and pattern recognition, once achieved, cannot be reversed. You cannot unsee a pattern. You can only choose whether to acknowledge what you have seen or to pretend that the pattern does not exist. And pretending requires energy. It requires the constant suppression of connections that your mind has already made. It requires you to become less intelligent, less observant, less capable of understanding the environment in which you operate. It requires, in other words, that you make yourself deliberately blind. The Imperium depends on this blindness, not the blindness of ignorance, but the blindness of intelligent people who have chosen not to see, who have recognized that seeing would require them to acknowledge truths that would make their duties impossible to perform. This is different from indoctrination. Indoctrination is what you do to people who have never encountered alternatives. What the Imperium does to its experienced soldiers, its veteran administrators, its long-serving priests, is something more sophisticated. It creates conditions where intelligence itself becomes a liability, where the smarter you are, the more you understand, the more you must suppress in order to remain functional. I began documenting the pattern. Not officially, of course, not in any format that would be discoverable by standard security reviews, but in my own mind, and eventually in encrypted personal files that I knew were a death sentence if discovered. I documented every world where I had witnessed the imperial integration process, every population that had been transformed from whatever they were into standardized imperial citizens, every social structure that had been dismantled, every alternative that had been eliminated. Kallista's world, a peaceful agricultural society destroyed by introducing the concept of external threat. Guest Tertius, an industrial population that had developed workers' councils for resource distribution, destroyed by re-establishing hierarchical control structures. Rycantus VII, a consensus-based society that had survived in extreme conditions for millennia, destroyed by introducing scarcity and individual ownership. Vorash Secundus, a mining colony that had attempted to negotiate tithe terms based on sustainable extraction rates, destroyed by military enforcement of unsustainable quotas. The pattern was clear. The Imperium did not merely respond to threats. It created compliance by first creating the conditions that made compliance necessary. It introduced scarcity to populations that had achieved abundance. It introduced hierarchy to populations that had developed egalitarian structures. It introduced fear to populations that had achieved stability. And then it presented itself as the solution to the problems it had created. This is not a conspiracy. This is not a hidden agenda. This is documented policy, implemented by millions of loyal servants who believe absolutely in its necessity. The Imperium does not hide what it does. It simply ensures that what it does is always framed as response rather than cause, as defense rather than aggression, as salvation rather than destruction. But the framing does not change the mechanics. And once you understand the mechanics, the framing becomes transparent. I began to wonder how many soldiers had reached this understanding before me. How many had recognized the pattern and then faced the same choice I now faced. Acknowledge it and become non-functional, or suppress it and become deliberately blind. I began to pay attention to the veterans, the ones who had survived multiple deployments, the ones who carried the same exhaustion in their eyes that I had seen in Prelate Jostin. They knew, not all of them, but some, a significant minority. They had seen what I had seen. They had recognized what I had recognized, and they had made the choice to continue serving because the alternative, acknowledging that their entire lives had been spent enforcing a system that destroyed the very things it claimed to protect, was psychologically unbearable. This is the Imperium's true genius. It does not need to suppress dissent through violence, though violence is always available. It suppresses dissent by making dissent psychologically impossible for the people most capable of recognizing the need for it. By the time a soldier has enough experience to understand what the Imperium actually does, that soldier has invested so much of their identity in serving the Imperium that understanding becomes a form of self-annihilation. I have killed thousands of people in service to the Imperium. If the Imperium's methods are unjustifiable, then my life's work has been the enforcement of an unjustifiable system. If the Imperium is not humanity's salvation, but its prison, then I have been a prison guard, and every person I killed was not an enemy, but a fellow prisoner who refused to accept their cell. This is not a realization that any functional human being can integrate into their self-concept. It is a realization that requires either denial or dissolution. So most choose denial. They choose to believe that the pattern they have recognized is not really a pattern, that the similarities between Imperial integration operations across dozens of worlds are coincidental, that the systematic destruction of alternatives is tragic but necessary, that there is no other way, that the Imperium, despite its brutality, despite its oppression, despite its endless appetite for human suffering, is still humanity's best hope for survival. And maybe they are right. Maybe I am the one who has lost perspective. Maybe the pattern I have recognized is a delusion born from too much combat and not enough rest. Maybe the questions I am asking are symptoms of psychological degradation rather than intellectual clarity. This is what I tell myself during the day, when I am performing my duties, when I am training soldiers, when I am enforcing discipline, when I am doing the 1,000 small tasks that maintain military functionality. But at night, when I am alone, when I cannot distract myself with duties or drown the questions in exhaustion, I know the truth. The pattern is real. The Imperium does systematically destroy alternatives, and I have been an instrument of that destruction for 2 decades. Our next deployment took us back to Catachan, not to the jungles, but to one of the recruitment stations where I had first entered Imperial service 23 years earlier. We were tasked with training a new generation of Catachan recruits, teaching them the skills that would transform them from jungle survivors into Imperial soldiers. This should have been a relief, a return to familiar territory, a chance to pass on knowledge to young soldiers who would need it to survive their deployments. Instead, it became a form of torture, because I was teaching them to be what I had become. I was teaching them to suppress curiosity, to not ask questions, to accept orders without demanding justification. I was teaching them to be effective instruments of Imperial policy, and I was doing so knowing that effectiveness meant participating in the systematic destruction of human diversity. I watched these young Catachans, fresh from the jungles that had killed their siblings and parents, eager to prove themselves capable, hungry for purpose and meaning, and I understood that I was betraying them. Not by teaching them incorrectly, my technical instruction was impeccable, but by not warning them about what they would become, about what the Imperium would use them to do, about the choice they would eventually face between understanding and functionality. One recruit, a young woman named Kella, who reminded me painfully of myself at 17, approached me after a training session. She had questions about Xeno's biology, about tactical adaptation, about the reasoning behind certain Imperial doctrines. She was intelligent, observant, Exactly the kind of soldier who would excel in combat and eventually recognize the patterns I had recognized. I should have encouraged her questions. I should have cultivated her intelligence. Instead, I told her that questions were acceptable in training but dangerous in combat. That a soldier who thinks too much is a soldier who hesitates. That survival requires acceptance rather than analysis. I told her this because I wanted to protect her from becoming what I had become. And in trying to protect her, I was ensuring she would become exactly what the Imperium needed her to be. An intelligent person who had learned to suppress intelligence in service to functionality. She thanked me for the advice. She said it made sense. She said she understood. And I saw in her eyes the beginning of the same process that had brought me to this point. The willingness to accept limitations on thought in exchange for clarity of purpose. The trade of understanding for effectiveness. The choice to not see in order to remain capable of action. I am teaching soldiers to be blind. And I am doing so because I know that blindness is the only thing that makes our duties bearable. And the fact that I understand this, that I can articulate it, that I am conscious of the process even as I perpetuate it, does not give me the power to stop. Because stopping would require me to refuse orders, and refusing orders would require me to accept that my entire life has been spent serving a system that I now believe is fundamentally corrupted, and accepting that would require a form of psychological suicide that I am not yet prepared to commit. So I continue. I train the soldiers. I follow the orders. I enforce the discipline. And I document, in these encrypted files that will likely never be read, the process by which a loyal servant of the Imperium comes to understand that loyalty itself may be the corruption, that the Imperium's greatest weapon is not its military might, but its ability to make its most effective servants complicit in their own ideological imprisonment. There's a conversation that occurs in every Imperial barracks across the galaxy, though it is never officially recorded and rarely acknowledged. It happens in the quiet hours before dawn, when exhaustion has stripped away the performance of certainty and soldiers speak to each other with honesty that would be dangerous in daylight. It is the conversation where someone asks, "What are we actually doing?" Not the tactical objective, not the strategic mission, but the fundamental purpose. What do we believe we are achieving? I have heard this conversation on 17 different worlds. The specific words change, but the structure is always identical. Someone asks the question. Others initially respond with official answers. We are defending humanity. We are enforcing the Emperor's will. We are holding the line against annihilation. But if the conversation continues, if no officer interrupts, if the exhaustion is deep enough, the answers begin to erode. Someone mentions a civilian they killed who did not seem like a threat. Someone describes a city they burned that could have been negotiated with. Someone questions why compliance requires so much destruction if the Imperium truly wants to preserve humanity. And then, inevitably, someone, usually a veteran, usually someone with enough experience to have recognized the pattern, provides the answer that ends the conversation. It does not matter what we believe we are achieving, because we're going to do it anyway. Our choices are to perform our duties or be executed for refusing to perform them. Therefore, belief is irrelevant. Only action matters. This is the mechanism of complicity, not forcing soldiers to believe in what they do, but making belief irrelevant to whether they do it. The Imperium does not need true believers. It only needs functional instruments. And functional instruments are created not through indoctrination, but through the elimination of alternatives. You serve the Imperium not because you believe in it, but because there is nothing else to believe in. Because every alternative has been systematically eliminated. Because the Imperium has structured reality itself so that compliance is the only viable response to existence. I used to think this was strength. I used to think this pragmatism was what separated the Imperium from the failed civilizations that preceded it. Faith is unreliable. Ideology is corruptible. But necessity is eternal. If you can make your system the only functional response to genuine threats, then your system becomes unkillable. It perpetuates not through conviction, but through the absence of alternatives. But I have come to understand that this is not strength. It is fragility masquerading as inevitability. Because a system that depends on the elimination of alternatives is a system that cannot adapt. It cannot learn. It cannot evolve. It can only replicate itself, consuming every resource and destroying every variation until there is nothing left but uniformity. And uniformity, in a changing environment, is extinction. The Imperium is 10,000 years old. In that time, it has conquered or destroyed millions of human populations. It has enforced compliance across 1 million worlds. It has created the largest unified human civilization in history. And in doing so, it has eliminated almost every experimental variation in human social organization, every alternative economic system, every different approach to governance, resource distribution, conflict resolution, cultural transmission. What if one of those alternatives held the key to humanity's long-term survival? What if there was a social structure, now destroyed, that could have resisted chaos corruption more effectively than imperial indoctrination? What if there was an economic system, now eliminated, that could have sustained human populations without the endless tithe extraction that leaves worlds depleted and desperate? What if there was a form of governance, now forgotten, that could have coordinated human effort without requiring the totalitarian suppression that defines imperial administration? We will never know, because the Imperium has spent 10,000 years ensuring that we cannot know. It has burned the evidence. It has executed the practitioners. It has restructured human consciousness itself, so that alternatives are not merely forbidden, but literally unthinkable. And I have been an instrument of this elimination. Every time I integrated a population into imperial compliance, I was not saving them from destruction. I was destroying the possibility that they might have found a different path. A path the Imperium could not permit to exist, because its existence would prove that the Imperium's claim to necessity was false. This realization has made me non-functional in ways that are not yet visible, but that I know will eventually manifest. I still follow orders. I still perform my duties with technical competence, but there is a distance now between the action and the actor. I watch myself enforce imperial policy as if I am observing someone else. I execute civilians who resist compliance, and I see, with perfect clarity, that their resistance is more rational than my obedience, that they have correctly identified the Imperium as a threat to whatever makes their lives meaningful, and that my role is to punish them for that correct identification. I am haunted not by guilt. Guilt would imply that I believe I had alternatives, but by understanding that the system I serve is not humanity's salvation, but its stagnation. That every act of imperial violence, no matter how tactically justified, is a strategic investment in humanity's ultimate extinction. That we are not holding the line against annihilation. We are ensuring that annihilation, when it comes, will be total. Because we have eliminated every variation that might have survived what the Imperium cannot. After 6 months of training duty on Catachan, I was redeployed to a world called Meridian's End. The mission briefing was standard: suppress an uprising, restore imperial authority, process rebel leadership for execution. But when we arrived, we discovered that the uprising was not what the briefing had described. There was no organized rebellion, no military resistance. What the Administratum had classified as an uprising was actually a population-wide work stoppage. The population of Meridian's End had simply stopped complying. They continued to maintain their infrastructure. They continued to feed themselves. They continued to organize their communities. They simply refused to produce the tithes the Imperium demanded. They refused to send their children for guard recruitment. They refused to acknowledge imperial authority. This should not have been possible. A population cannot survive by simply refusing imperial demands. The Imperium has infinite patience and infinite soldiers. It can reduce any world to compliance through the application of sufficient force. Resistance is not futile. That would imply it has some effect. Resistance is irrelevant. The Imperium will win because it is willing to destroy everything in order to maintain control, and no population can match that commitment to destruction. But Meridian's End had calculated differently. They had recognized that the Imperium's power depended on their productivity, that without their labor, their resources, their compliance, the Imperium gained nothing by destroying them, that the Imperium would rather have a compliant world than a dead world, and that this preference was a weakness that could be exploited. They were wrong, of course. The Imperium does not negotiate. It does not compromise. It does not accept partial compliance. But their miscalculation was interesting because it revealed that they had been thinking about the Imperium systematically. They had analyzed its incentives. They had identified what they believed were its constraints. They had attempted to find a position within imperial structure that would allow them autonomy without requiring military conflict. They had tried to imagine a form of resistance that the Imperium would tolerate, and the fact that they tried proved that they had not yet understood what the Imperium actually was, what it required, what it would accept. They still believed the Imperium was an organization with rational objectives that could be negotiated with. They did not understand that the Imperium's only objective was compliance itself, that productivity, resource extraction, military recruitment, all of these were secondary to the fundamental requirement that every human population accept imperial authority without question or condition. Our orders were explicit: end the work stoppage within 30 days, or implement Protocol Extremis. Protocol Extremis meant orbital bombardment, the complete sterilization of the world surface, the murder of 400 million people as a lesson to other worlds that might consider similar resistance. I requested clarification from command. I asked whether negotiations had been attempted, whether we could achieve compliance through economic incentives rather than violence, whether there was any alternative between acceptance of the work stoppage and planetary annihilation. The response was immediate and unambiguous. Negotiations would establish precedent. If the Imperium accepted nonviolent resistance on one world, it would encourage nonviolent resistance on others. The Imperium could not permit this. Not because the work stoppage itself was threatening. 400 million people represented a negligible percentage of Imperial population, but because the method of resistance, if successful, could spread, could become an alternative that other populations might attempt, could create the possibility that Imperial authority was negotiable rather than absolute. Therefore, Meridian's end would be destroyed, not as punishment for their resistance, but as proof that their method of resistance was ineffective, that the Imperium would rather annihilate a world and accept the precedent of negotiated compliance, that there was no form of resistance, no matter how peaceful, no matter how rational, that the Imperium would tolerate. I did not participate in the orbital bombardment of Meridian's end. My unit was withdrawn 3 days before Protocol Extremis was implemented. We were told this was standard procedure. Ground forces are not required for planetary sterilization operations, but I have come to believe it was something else, that the Imperium understands that forcing soldiers to witness the annihilation of entire populations creates the kind of psychological damage that makes them unreliable, that there is a difference between killing in combat and watching 400 million people burn from orbit, that the first can be integrated into a soldier's identity, but the second cannot. So they removed us. They protected us from understanding the full scope of what our service enables. And in doing so, they protected themselves from the questions we might ask if we understood. But I asked anyway. I filed a formal inquiry about the fate of Meridian's end. I was told the information was classified above my clearance level. I filed a second inquiry, citing my need to understand the strategic outcome of operations I had participated in. I was told that my participation had ended when my unit was withdrawn, and that further inquiries would be noted in my service record as evidence of inappropriate curiosity about classified strategic decisions. The message was clear: do not ask about Meridian's end. Do not think about Meridian's end. Perform your duties and accept that some decisions are made at levels where your understanding is neither required nor welcomed. I should have accepted this. I should have recognized that my inquiries were creating exactly the kind of documentation that would eventually result in commissarial review. But I could not accept it, because Meridian's end represented something that I needed to understand, not the tactical decision. I understood perfectly why the Imperium had chosen annihilation over negotiation, but the strategic implication. What did it mean that the Imperium would rather destroy 400 million productive citizens than accept a single precedent of negotiated authority? It meant that the Imperium valued compliance more than productivity, more than resources, more than the lives of the populations it claimed to protect. It meant that imperial authority was not a means to an end, the preservation of humanity, but an end in itself, that the system had become more important than the purpose the system was meant to serve. This is the realization that I can no longer suppress. This is the understanding that has made me non-functional. Not non-functional in any way that is visible to my commanders. I still follow orders, I still maintain discipline, I still perform my duties with technical competence, but non-functional in the sense that I no longer believe my actions serve the purpose I was told they served. I am not defending humanity. I am defending the system that controls humanity. And those are not the same thing. They might have been the same thing once. In the early Imperium, when the threats were immediate and the system was still being built, perhaps compliance and survival were genuinely synonymous. But after 10,000 years, after 1,000,000 worlds, after the elimination of every alternative and the suppression of every variation, compliance has become divorced from survival. It has become its own justification. The Imperium no longer asks whether its methods serve humanity's preservation. It simply demands that humanity serve its methods. And I have spent 23 years enforcing those methods. I have killed thousands of people who resisted compliance. I have integrated dozens of populations into imperial structure. I have trained hundreds of soldiers to do what I have done, and I have done all of this believing that it was necessary, that the galaxy's hostility justified the Imperium's brutality, that there was no alternative. But there were alternatives. I have seen them. I have documented them, and I have watched the Imperium destroy them, not because they were threats, but because they were proof that alternatives existed, that humanity could organize itself in ways other than the Imperial model. That compliance was a choice rather than a necessity. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to make that choice invisible, trying to structure reality so that compliance appears to be the only rational response to existence, and it has largely succeeded. Most Imperial citizens, most Imperial soldiers, most Imperial administrators genuinely believe that the Imperium is humanity's only hope. They believe this not because they have been lied to, but because the Imperium has systematically eliminated every piece of evidence that might suggest otherwise. But I have seen the evidence, and now I am faced with the question that Prelate Jostin faced, the question that breaks loyalty without providing an alternative, the question that creates understanding without offering resolution. What do I do with what I know? I cannot rebel. Rebellion would be immediately suppressed, and my death would serve no purpose except to provide the Imperium with another example of the consequences of disloyalty. I cannot speak openly. Open speech would result in execution and the suppression of everything I have documented. I cannot refuse orders. Refusal would be treason, and treason against the Imperium is punished not just with execution, but with the retroactive erasure of the traitor's entire service record, ensuring that even their loyal years are forgotten. So I continue to serve. I continue to follow orders. I continue to enforce compliance, and I do so knowing that every action I take perpetuates a system that I now believe is humanity's cage rather than its salvation. This is the mechanism of complicity in its purest form, not forcing me to believe in what I do, but making it impossible for me to stop doing it even after I have stopped believing. I have become what the Imperium needs me to be, a loyal servant who understands that loyalty is a trap, an effective instrument who recognizes that effectiveness is complicity, a survivor who has learned that survival requires the suppression of everything that makes survival meaningful. Catachan taught me that survival requires adaptation, that the universe is hostile and only those who respond to threats appropriately will persist. But what Catachan did not teach me, what it could not teach me, because Catachan itself is a product of Imperial structure, is how to recognize when the thing you are adapting to is itself the threat, when the system you are serving is the predator, when survival requires not adaptation but resistance. I do not know if resistance is possible. I do not know if the Imperium can be reformed, challenged, or replaced. I do not even know if it should be, because the threats the Imperium warns about are real. Chaos is real. Xenos are real. The galaxy's hostility is not exaggerated. And perhaps the Imperium, despite its brutality, despite its oppression, despite its systematic destruction of human possibility, is still the best system available for navigating that hostility. Perhaps the Imperium is exactly what it claims to be, a necessary evil. Perhaps my recognition of its mechanisms is not wisdom, but naivety. Perhaps the questions I am asking are luxuries that only someone protected by imperial power could afford to ask. Perhaps the alternatives I have seen destroyed would have failed eventually, and the Imperium's elimination of them was an act of mercy rather than suppression. I do not know. And this uncertainty is what makes this record both confession and question. I am not declaring the Imperium unjustifiable. I am not advocating for rebellion. I am simply documenting what I have seen and what I have understood, and leaving the interpretation to whoever discovers this record. If you are reading this, you are either an Imperial authority who has discovered my heresy, or you are someone who has survived long enough to ask the same questions I have asked. If you are the former, know that I have never refused an order. I have never advocated disloyalty. I have never acted against Imperial interests. My only crime is understanding too much about what my service requires. Execute me if you must, but recognize that execution will not eliminate the questions I have asked. Those questions exist independent of me. They are built into the structure of Imperial compliance itself. Every intelligent soldier who serves long enough will eventually recognize them. If you are the latter, if you're someone who has also recognized the pattern, then know that you are not alone. Know that the exhaustion you feel is not weakness, but comprehension. Know that the distance between your actions and your understanding is not cowardice, but the recognition that there are no clean choices in a system that has eliminated alternatives. You will continue to serve because there is nothing else to do. And you will carry the weight of understanding what your service perpetuates. This is what it means to be a veteran of the Imperium. Not someone who has survived combat, but someone who has survived understanding. I am recording this confession on Catachan, in the jungle where I was born. I have returned here on leave, ostensibly to visit the settlement where I was raised. But the settlement is gone. It was consumed by the jungle 15 years ago. There is nothing left but vegetation and the bones of people who were not strong enough to survive. This is what Catachan does. It eliminates the weak. It creates survivors. And it teaches those survivors that elimination is natural, that strength is the only virtue, that survival justifies any method. The Imperium is Catachan. It is a system that has structured itself to eliminate everything that cannot survive within it, and then claims that this elimination is natural, that it is necessary, that there is no alternative. And perhaps there is not. Perhaps the galaxy is exactly as hostile as the Imperium claims, and perhaps the Imperium's methods are the only viable response to that hostility. But I have seen what those methods destroy. I have seen populations that had achieved peace, prosperity, stability, all of which were eliminated because they represented alternatives to Imperial structure. I have seen the Imperium create the very threats it claims to defend against, manufacturing rebellion through the act of suppression, generating resistance through the enforcement of compliance. And I have seen soldiers like myself, intelligent, capable, loyal, who have recognized these patterns and then faced the choice between understanding and function, between knowledge and effectiveness, between seeing clearly and remaining able to act. Most choose function. Most choose to suppress what they understand in order to continue serving, because the alternative is psychological dissolution. The alternative is accepting that your entire life has been spent enforcing a system that you now believe is fundamentally corrupted, and that acceptance is a form of death that execution cannot match. I do not know which choice I will make. I do not know if I will continue suppressing this understanding in order to remain functional, or if the understanding will eventually make function impossible. I do not know if documenting this confession is an act of resistance or simply a way of distributing the weight I can no longer carry alone. What I know is this: the Imperium will continue. It will continue because it has eliminated every alternative. It will continue because it has structured reality so that continuation appears to be necessity. It will continue because soldiers like me, even those who understand what the Imperium actually does, will continue to serve it, because there is nothing else to serve. Because resistance is not futile but impossible. Because the Imperium has won not by being right, but by making rightness irrelevant. And in that continuation, in that inevitable persistence, lies the question that this confession cannot answer, but cannot avoid asking. If the system that controls us has made alternatives impossible, and if that impossibility ensures the system's continuation regardless of whether it should continue, then what does survival actually mean? What are we preserving? What part of humanity persists after 10,000 years of systematic elimination of everything that makes humanity adaptable? The Imperium claims it is saving us. But saving us for what? For a future where we are finally safe? Or for a future where we have become so uniform, so standardized, so incapable of variation that we are no longer recognizably human? Where survival has been achieved at the cost of everything that makes survival valuable? I am a Catachan Jungle Fighter. I have survived things that would kill any ordinary human. I have been forged by a world that tests every assumption and eliminates every weakness. And what I have learned, after 23 years of Imperial service, is that the greatest threat to humanity is not Xenos or chaos, or the galaxy's infinite hostility. The greatest threat is the thing we have built to protect ourselves, the Imperium, and I do not know how to survive it.